This is the first of what we hope is going to be many exhibitions which celebrate these artists as individuals, as you know, the geniuses that they are and were, and bark is just, and earth pigments are just the medium through which they speak. So I'm going to start just by giving a little introduction to Malcom for those of you that don't know him. Malcom doesn't know this, but even before I met him, he was a bit of a hero of mine. That's just a bit of embarrassment to get out of the way first. That Malcom Davidson is the director of Art Oceanic, which was formerly known as the Aboriginal and Pacific Art Gallery, Melbourne's longest running tribal art gallery that specialises in traditional Aboriginal, Melanesian and Polynesian artefacts and art. The gallery was founded by Malcolm's father in 1961 and mother Irene Davidson, Jim and Irene Davidson. It operated for over 50 years in Ivanhoe in Melbourne, and in 1991 Malcom became the second generation to operate the art gallery. After starting his career as a landscape architect, Malcom made the transition into the world of ethnographic art and artefacts in his early 30s. In 2009, Malcom relocated the gallery to Brighton, a beachside suburb in Melbourne. I first met Malcom back in 2010 when I was working in the Indigenous Art Department of the National Gallery of Victoria, and my colleague then, Judith Ryan, who many of you will know, took me along to meet Malcom at the gallery in Ivanhoe, and she said that, Luke, you're about to meet one of the most knowledgeable people in the sector, but not only is he one of the most knowledgeable people in the sector, he's also one of the most ethical, and he happens to be a lovely person. So when I entered the gallery, I was all primed that I was going to step on hallowed ground, and I certainly remember walking into that gallery in Ivanhoe and just being really overawed with the way the gallery was set up, the history of the place, but also obviously the art and objects on display. So welcome, Malcom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It sounds a very interesting person, doesn't it?
It does sound a very interesting person, and perhaps you sound very interesting because you are very interesting. Let's start with your dad, with Jim. He had a fascinating life, a really interesting history. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Yes. Well, we go back to the Great Depression. No, I'm not going to. Oh. He was old.
Yeah.
In the 1890s, there was a Great Depression in Melbourne, so his father and brother went to South Africa to get work. The father marries an Afrikaner woman, and they have 5 children, one of which was my father, the oldest. Now, the youngest, the mother dies of mastitis, and the youngest child dies a week later. And the doctor says the father's also not well, you need to come back to Australia. So they ended up in an apple orchard in Tasmania. This was in the 1920s. My father was born in 1908. There he became got a certificate in mining engineering and surveying, and went to work in Fiji for the Emperor Gold Mine, but had a keen interest in Melanesian material. Then went to New Guinea and mapped the fly river for Standard Oil. This is pre-Second World War. Then came back to Australia, and after the war ran a coffee plantation up there. In between he got married. Didn't do a particularly good job of that one, and got divorced. But in 1958, he was giving a lecture in Dalesford. He was working at that stage for the Forestry Commission. Halfway through, and it was a lecture on Melanesian art and artefacts. Halfway through that lecture, he went into there was an intermission, and there was my mother. Now, she found it a particularly boring talk, and she was trying to go home. He talked to her, and he thought he'd knocked it out of the park with his presentation. Anyway, 12 months later, they got married. And the honeymoon was in Alice Springs, where they saw Hermannsburg watercolours. And they decided, well, they're pretty interesting. And there's a woman there, Mrs. Frost, who was quite a legend at the time, They brought them back to Melbourne and they started doing exhibitions and displaying it. 1961, some bark paintings were sent down to them from Arnhem, and I thought, oh, that's what it's really about. And then in 1962, he returned for the next 15 years to Arnhem Land in wintertime to buy and trade bark paintings. Along the way, he also dealt in Melanesian and other artefacts, but that was his area.
And out of all of the areas that he collected and was interested in, did he have one place or region that was a particular passion of his?
So, absolutely. He loved going to Arnhem Land. He'd disappear for 6 weeks every year in wintertime. Manningrida, so West Arnhem Land, which is the bark you see over here without the background. Central Arnhem Land, which is that has a little bit more detail, and then Northeast Arnhem Land or Yirrkala. Yirrkala was where he had the real passion, and also because he could relate well with the. I often thought he fitted in better up there than in Melbourne.
And those 6 weeks in Arnhem Land, what did that look like? What was he primarily spending his time doing during that time?
He would be going to the art centres which were set up by run by the missions in that period, because most of the missions left about 1974, 75. And, you know, he kept books or records of, it was interesting how they priced works then. It was more on height, not the artist, not the content. And, you know, I've read some of the early letters that were sent to him and said, look, you know, we're not paying much for this material, but it's about keeping people. So the intent of why it was produced is quite interesting. But he had a bonus system, so artists that sold well, he would still remember him packing up bonuses to take back up there and trade items like, you know, maybe tobacco or glasses and different things for people. So
and your involvement, what was some of your early memories of your dad's collecting and the gallery? And
so the word gallery is interesting. This was a house, a pretty modest house in Ivanhoe, that every room was cram-packed with material. So I grew up, I was born in 1962, that's when he started. So I opened my eyes and this is what I saw. You know, I was a bit chubby back then, and I could play the didgeridoo quite well, even at primary school. So whenever we had guests who wanted, I'd be called out as the cute little kid to play the didgeridoo.
Yeah.
It's a very good selling technique.
yeah.
So I grew up with this material. Then probably about age 10, he took me on a few trips up to Arnhem Land. And what's really interesting as a young kid, you know, I sat down with Mungaroy Yunupingu, and he painted this beautiful painting of a Macassan Prow, which I still have. It's actually in Melbourne at the Ian Potter Museum, has a magnificent exhibition on at the moment. And that's Judith Ryan put it together. And apart from the museum's collection, she's got private works in there as well. So that Prow sits there, which is pretty interesting. But as a 10-year-old, you have no concept of colour or race. It's quite interesting. Racism's taught to us, really. So I would go there, and I realised later it was free labour. He was looking for someone to help him pack parcels and do things. But I'd go out crabbing with the women and doing lots of different things. So it was a great introduction. And
your interests took you in different directions as your line of work. You moved into landscape architecture.
That's right. Yes.
And was there any kind of pressure or interest earlier to kind of become more involved and follow in your father's footsteps in those early years? Or?
My father was a very tough person, so you don't want to walk necessarily in the footsteps of someone. You want to find your own interest and passion. And I actually loved landscape architecture and design. My mother was a commercial artist, so I went on that path. But they are related, because about aesthetics and form and design,
Mm.
and dealing in Melanesian and Polynesian objects. I look at weapons or clubs or sculptures, and you can look at the aesthetic of those objects, the beauty of those objects.
Mm. Mm. Your dad developed a number of special relationships with a number of men, primarily in northeast Arnhem Land, and probably the artist that he's credited with working with most specifically is Narendra Maymaru. What was it about that relationship that those two men developed that was particularly unique and existed for over 20 years?
So that's this is a work up here by Narendra, which you may or may not be familiar with. And people, so my father had a very close relationship with him until Narendra died in about 1981 or 82. But it's not about the painting, it's about the person. And you look at, as you mentioned, we were talking about the ages. When my father met him, it would have been 1962. He was a man in his 40s at that point. He was only 8 years younger than my father. So you look at Narendra as a person, and if you look at the photos, he's a very tall, sinewy person, strong. You can see the charisma with him. But when he was born, he wasn't, the missionaries weren't there. They didn't arrive until 1935. There's some debate whether he was involved in the Japanese massacre of 5 Japanese pearlers in about 1932. So he was a great fighter as well. And that's when, I don't know if you're familiar with Donald Thompson at all. So Donald Thompson arrives in Arnhem Land to pacify the situation because the Yolngu were angry and there was tension there. The police were looking at punitive punishments. So he was there to calm the waters. And at the same time, Reverend Wilbur Chaselin set up the mission there in 1930. And Narendra was a person that accepted change quite easily. So he was very helpful in developing it. Then the war came along and Narendra was on a warship, a Navy ship, going from Maningrida to Elcho Island. That was bombed by the Japanese. The boat sank. There was people left in the water. The Japanese came back and bombed those people and machine gunned them for half an hour. Then they got a little life raft and managed to make it. 18 survived, managed to make it to a little island. And then Narendra was instrumental in rescuing them all. So you begin to see what sort of person he was. In 1946, I think Ronald Burnt goes there. And if you have, I don't know if anyone's been down to the New South Wales Art Gallery, it was fantastic. There's these crown drawings there. So Ronald Burnt is meant to have bought the first painting off Narendra. Then he goes and sends them back butcher's paper or paper and crowns to draw. So we're looking at some of the earliest works. Donald Thompson collected some, but these are really early ones. And you can see the artistic merit in works by Mungaroy and Nanyan, his brother.
To move into the business of art, what's become Art Oceanic.
There was a gradual change in it. So I was working as a landscape architect from about 1985, and my father died in 1994. But from about 85 onwards, it started to run down. He died at 86, and stock was dwindling. I would go around there, particularly when we had the recession in 89. I had a day off from the architectural firm. So I'd go around there and work in that area. And it's very difficult to make that step to decide to be a second generation person. Like, am I in the shadow of this other person? And my interest was probably more in the Melanesian and Polynesian side. And I'd also started a business myself in landscape architecture, but then I started doing deals and finding material and placing material. And I then moved from landscape architecture into doing a bit of development work, which freed me up to get involved in the gallery, which worked. And the internet came along, which was a big game changer, as well as my mother, who doesn't get a lot of credit, but she actually had the artistic eye and she loved this material. So the two of us worked together in a very close relationship, so it was fantastic. And then there was a point that I got to where I couldn't do everything. So I transitioned across into dealing in Oceanic and Aboriginal material.
I remember on my first visit, actually it was my second visit to your gallery that I visited with my partner at the time, and the one thing I'd chosen in there that I loved and that I thought I could afford, he said, "Oh no, that's my mother's. She would absolutely kill me if I sold that to you."
Well, we did have a point where my mother, my father would ask where certain things were, and so my mother was 20 years younger as well, and she didn't want him to sell it. Now, he'd been in a bad accident in the 40s and had a steel pin in his leg, so he couldn't bend down easily. So she'd hide things under the bed in places that she couldn't get to. I don't know where that's gone.
Yeah. All for her own collection purpose. Yeah. So in your time in the market, you would have seen an extraordinary change in the way that Australian First Nations art in particular is marketed and sold and displayed in our institutions. Can you just talk to us a little bit about those changes that you've seen?
So it's a very interesting question. It probably, to me, it goes back to about 1960. A lot of this material was seen. So we didn't have contemporary acrylic paintings or dot paintings. That was 1971. So we go, this material was seen as ethnographic. Anthropology was the main path that people followed. We had Darwin's, Origin of Species just published in 1859. We had colonisation of the Pacific. So the thinkers, the people who were really interested in this culture, were pursuing it on an ethnographic level. And the collections of Baldwin Spence from 1910 and even Ronald Burnt, Donald Thompson, these were ethnographic collections. So an ethnographic item is something of historic, cultural importance. It could be utilitarian, but it's actually often with groups of people. It could be religious as well. And it's often with cultures that don't have a written word. So it's a window into understanding these people. So these things are seen as ethnographic. And then along with that was all those texts about Aboriginal people, the Stone Age people, Paleolithic stone tools. So we have Paleolithic and Neolithic. Paleolithic is described as flints and stones, the earliest form of stone tools, and then they were moved into Neolithic, which was when people that farmed and had agriculture. So these were European models, and they thought they'd layer that description over other cultures and without looking at the uniqueness of it. So there was a rush to Australia. Baldwin Spence is a classic example to try and explain the existence. Primitive art can't possibly be fine art. So then we go forward, and it's not definitive, but certainly the Art Gallery of New South Wales with Tony Tuxton was a turning point. So he was gifted by Dr. Scougal, who had the assistant Dorothy Bennett, and they acquired bark paintings in the 60s, and he made a decision. I'm going to display those. I'm not going to put the information there. And it's called the Universal Aesthetic. And the difference between ethnographic, I had to think about this, the difference between ethnographic displays, everything's crammed into a cabinet and you're looking at multiple examples, but it's like in this gallery here, we see every work is hung with the negative space around it so it can breathe. So then these objects moved, how dare a primitive item, rub shoulders at the party with all these European masters and things. So he brought them into that arena. It's a different way of thinking about the objects. But there was a long journey. So we had Judith Ryan, you know, the pioneers in that, she was 1977, 48 years at the National Gallery, multiple publications. Wally Caruana for 16 years at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. We had dealers like Gabriella Roy, who's still trading as well.
Yep.
Gabriella Pizzi, a lot of women actually, pioneering to get recognition for these works. So then I actually looked through the other day, Sotheby's, the auction room that came to town. I don't know whether you're familiar with the sales that they used to do, but even their catalogues, they came here in 1975, 1982, they produced a catalogue. But still there's Shields, there's New Guinea, there's Oceanic, maybe just one line at the back, not even pictures. It's the whole collection. Then it was still called tribal art, and they struggled. But 1994, Tim Klingener bursts on the scene, and he sets up the Contemporary Art Department, and in 1996, the Aboriginal Art Department. And suddenly those catalogues have single pictures, essays. So there's all these different places. And then he travelled the shows overseas as well, in creating recognition and a new approach to how we view these objects. So we go from ethnographic, you know, primitive culture, trying to understand what's civilized and what's primitive, into a recognition of the beauty of these objects. Now, in thinking about this, I do struggle that you have someone, anyone familiar with Marcel Duchamp?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So we're discussing whether these things have artistic merit. In the 1917, he can put a porcelain urinal into a show, sign it, call it a fountain, and he starts an art movement. So it's a fickle world, the art market, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I had the thought, thinking about that question today, walking through Yolngu of Power at the Art Gallery of New South Wales today, and just thinking, even in the relatively short time that I've worked in the sector, just an exhibition like that where you'll have, you know, a major Australian cultural institution dedicate such a large part of their gallery space to Indigenous art. I think even that is, you know, and comparing that to the space that was dedicated to Australian First Nations art prior to that at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, that's a really significant change, and it is really people like the Judith Ryans, the Hetty Perkins at these major institutions who have led that change at our institutions, where the majority of our change kind of comes from. Talking about barkmasses, the exhibition, are there any particular barks in here? I mean, of course, the Narrandin. I mean, you must kind of, every one of his barks must resonate with you in some way. Are there any other barks in here that kind of really resonate with you as a collector yourself?
Well, if you said to me, thank you for giving the talk, you can take one.
Yes. Hypothetically, of course. Yeah.
I would pick the Watto or the Port Keats one hanging in the front there, by
Jamari, yeah.
Jamari, yes. In the past, I wouldn't have. So it's interesting how you develop or change your ideas. Watto or Port Keats didn't traditionally have bark paintings, nor did Kimberley's, you know. So it's interesting, where did these things, nor did West Australia, they were part of bark shells. A lot of them were commissioned with anthropologists going there. So there was a form, but Watto didn't really have them. And in fact, it was a Catholic mission in 1935, and they promoted the production of Christian art. So it's interesting how these missionaries can influence how items are produced. 1960, they then decided we needed a bark, probably looking at Arnhem Land, and I think the bark was actually flown in from Arnhem because they couldn't grow. They didn't have Eucalyptus tetradontus with it, which was a tree that the barks are made from.
Mm.
Then William Stanner, do people who have heard of William Stanner, who was an anthropologist, was there from 36 to 60. And this is, Nim Banduk was a close friend of his.
Mm.
And he asked Nim Banduk, who was one of the leaders there in 59, can you paint me some maps, some Dreamtime maps? And these big panels were produced. And Stanner wrote, it was like describing a shoe to someone who had never seen one and then asking them to draw it. And I thought that was quite, he said, so it's imaginary, once you've worked out it's an ideas map, but these were very legitimate works. Now, the National Gallery of Australia went and bought the whole set with Stanner's notes in 1922-23. So they're culturally very significant. And the artist here was seen, Stanner wrote about him, and he said, well, the relationship's complex. And when anyone says a relationship's complex, you know there's a bit of trouble going on there. So he was a very senior man, a fighter. He could, in your catalogue, it's he was a great dancer. He could dodge spears. No one wanted to get in a fight with him because he was a very good spear thrower, and he actually claimed he could dodge bullets, So you're looking at this work there, and Port Keiths or Wadeye is an interesting place because it wasn't an homogenous community. There was lots of communities from out in the desert coming in, which allowed for the transfer of ideas, I guess. So on that painting you see there, you'll see the circles which look like desert Tingari cycle, which I've had a few paintings like that. The halo around the top may relate to Wanjinas or the rain, which is a sign of cloud or the wet season. So it's to me, it's a particularly interesting painting, which in the past I would have dismissed. So yeah, I think it's a great work. Burundi's work behind you, which is from Central Arnhem Land. I love that as well because it's according to Wally Caruana wrote about this painting, and he suspects it's like a study or a precursor to the Easter panels that were done in Milingimbi in 62 or 63, and it's Jesus crucified with the Roman soldiers. But the thing I love about it, I don't quite understand why everyone's happy and smiling. But it's not something really made for sale. It's a interpretation of Christianity and ideas. So I find I've seen a lot of Narragan's work, and I've seen every one of these artists has them. There's Urawalla, there's Wally Mandug, there's a whole range, but I like these more obscure, as I get older, the more obscure paintings. And the other really interesting one is the Tiwi bark.
Just on the other side of the wall,
Right, which is about 1964, possibly commissioned by Dorothy Bennett, who did a lot of work in that Tiwi area. But it's a story of Purukapali and his brother and Bhima, his wife. And it's almost like Adam and Eve, where the wife, I don't know whether you know this story, but the wife cheats on her husband by having relations with the brother. And Purukapali, the husband, and the baby dies from dehydration. The brother says, I can bring that child back to life. But Purukapali says, no. And he carries the child out to sea and said, from this day forward, everyone will die and end. So it got similarities to certain things, I think, It's like the Adam and Eve story. Yeah. And to see it displayed like that in the size of a little figure of a woman is unusual for Tiwi art. So that's why I find that one particularly interesting.
Yeah. And an extraordinarily rare figurative depiction of that story. And also a really fascinating kind of insight, kind of post-history after it was completed as to, the authorship of the painting and and how that was determined by the missionaries at the time, and how that has kind of changed over time as well, which is equally interesting. And yeah, getting back to the Fort Keats work, in researching the catalogue, I was kind of really reminded, I suppose, of such was the geographic kind of spread of the demographic at Port Keats. You had people with connections to the northern coast of the Northern Territory, right down to the Northern Tanami. An extraordinary breadth, and really, that art movement really brought all that country and knowledge and aesthetics together, and it's really one of the great kind of we were talking about this earlier. It's just this area of Australian art history that's really underdeveloped, and not enough research, not enough looking and thinking done to it. And we hope over the coming years that we'll bring a really keen eye to that part of the world. Talking about the medium of bark. When we were preparing for this earlier, we were talking about how there's almost a distrust in the medium about its durability, and you said some really interesting things that I'm wondering if you can repeat, just about your thoughts on the medium itself and its longevity.
Well, I mean, that has always been an issue that people say, well, is it an ephemeral work of art? How has it changed? Well, I look around here and we're seeing barks that are 65 years old. Some you look at the exhibitions, some are in perfect condition. Partly it depends on the fixatives that we use. So orchid was used initially, orchid juice. And I read in the catalogue that Wally Mandard, who didn't particularly like Ballender or white people, refused to use it and kept using orchid juice. But then PVA came in. And so fixatives were added to the paint. Conservation can be done to these works, but we're looking at works here which are in incredibly good condition. I say to people, if you see something falling to bits, don't buy it. Some things do deteriorate. If you go into a beach house and you look at the bookcases and all the books there have turned blue because ultraviolet and infrared ray affected. You don't hang an artwork in front of a window over a heater. With any form, it deteriorates. So there is conservation, but old barks retain their integrity. Art Go of New South Wales. There's a bark down there which was collected by, was painted by Wongu. He was an old tribal leader, and I think probably collected by Donald Thompson. Now, that had been glued onto a board. And so when you get this interference, when a bark is glued onto a board, there's movement at differential rates of timber, so you get splitting. But the systems now in place are incredibly good for the conservation of bark paintings.
And just a final question to finish up on is again, in some recent conversations we've shared, you've spoken of the pleasure that you've found of kind of taking a breath after a really long career that continues.
Thank you.
But taking that time to kind of slow down and read and go down some rabbit holes and really spend some time researching your passions. Can you share that with everyone?
So I tend to buy now. I don't ever take anything on consignment, and I buy objects because I love them, But recently there was, and as you get older, you have time to, stuff I believed in when I was 20, I don't believe in anymore. So you have to be open-minded to change. And there's a story about there's a guy called Robert Edwards, who's a remarkable person. He was a curator at the South Australian Museum, different art boards, Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, set up exhibitions in Australia. But he came down to see my father, and he bought these boards in 1975, which were the early Papunya boards. And he said to my father, "Jim, you got to get into this stuff." And he said, "Oh, bloody rubbish, you'll never take off." But that was back in that ethnographic view. If it's made on wood, on masonite with different coloured paints, it's not traditional. And he wasn't the only one with that thought, you know. Other people in the industry felt the same way, but history has proved him quite wrong. What I find now really interesting, I had there was a headpiece coming up for auction in Europe, and a client in the States was interested in buying it. I had no idea what it was, but I asked Kim Ackerman, who was an expert, and he gave me this incredible information about it. And then the buyer of the piece said, well, will Kim write that up for me? And I said, look, yeah, I'm sure he will. You'll have to pay him. But Kim was this old, just knew a lot about the Kimberleys, an academic, used to be the curator at the Darwin Art Gallery. And he said, I've got a matrix I've put together over my whole life. When I get little bits of information, I can add it in and I can find it straight away. And this is fantastic. So I was discovering all this stuff, and the guy rings me back and says, how'd we go? And I said, well, Kim has agreed to write this up for you, but we have a problem. He died 2 days later. So we're finding these experts with field knowledge are disappearing. I then I went to the Kimberley after that, and books that I'd ignored reading, I suddenly, if you're in that environment, it changes your whole impression on what the objects were. So I found out some interesting material that I could fill in what Kim had done. And it was incredibly satisfying. So the research part is very enjoyable.
Mate, thanks so much for being here today and for sharing your passion. I know everyone can sense Malcolm's passion for the material, and we hope that some of that passion is really rubbing off on you guys, and that you've, through this conversation, received a little bit of an insight into not just the works on the wall, but the, you know, we're very lucky as Australians to have this as part of our cultural and artistic heritage, which, we can all share in and enjoy. So thank you, Malcolm, for today. And I'm sure everyone wants to join me in thanking Malcolm as well.